When duty to love collides with duty to save, where does your heart ride? The sun climbed steady over the Llano Estacado, painting the grassland gold and casting long shadows from the mesquite. Jake Torrens had been riding since before dawn, his buckskin gelding picking its way through the broken country south of the Brazos. Once, in the grey light before sunrise, he thought he heard distant hoofbeats hammering toward Willow Creek, too many horses for ranch work at that hour. A sharp crack followed, like a rifle echo swallowed quickly by the wind, then silence. He told himself it was nothing, but the unease rode with him. In his vest pocket, pressed flat against his ribs, lay a folded marriage paper creased from handling, the ink still dark where he'd signed his name 3 days past. He was riding to meet Eleanor Briggs at the church in Cedar Ridge, where Preacher Hawkins would read them their vows at sunset. The paper represented everything he'd worked for. A small spread north of town, a woman who'd waited 2 years for him to prove himself, and a future that didn't involve sleeping under stars or eating beans from a can. A single scream ripped the canvas of his plans. Jake reined in the buckskin and listened. Nothing but wind through grass and the distant call of a red-tailed hawk. Then it came again, high, desperate, carrying the edge of real fear. He spurred the buckskin toward the sound, weaving between mesquite clumps and prickly pear. The scream had come from a draw, maybe a quarter-mile east, where the land dipped toward Willow Creek. What he found there stopped him cold. A bay mare lay thrashing on her side, a jagged gash across her hindquarters, pumping blood into the sandy soil. Beside her knelt a girl in a torn riding habit, her dark hair spilling loose from its pins. She couldn't have been more than 16, with the kind of pale skin that spoke of money and shelter from the Sunday. "Please," she said when she saw him. "Please help us." Jake swung down from his horse, ground-tying the buckskin with a practiced flip of the reins. The mare's wound looked deep. Something had torn through hide and muscle, maybe a sharp branch or a piece of rusted metal hidden in the brush. "What happened here?" he asked, kneeling beside the injured animal. "We were racing," the girl said, her voice steady despite the tears on her cheeks. "Belle and I, we race every morning." But something spooked her near the creek, a rattler maybe, or a javelina. She reared up and came down hard on something sharp. Jake examined the wound. It was bad, but not mortal if they could stop the bleeding and get the mare somewhere safe. The girl herself seemed unhurt, except for some scrapes and the loss of one riding boot. "What's your name, miss?" "Charity Hawkins. My father's the preacher in Cedar Ridge." The name hit Jake like a fist to the gut. Preacher Hawkins, the same man who'd been marrying him to Eleanor at sunset. This was the preacher's daughter, and if she didn't make it home safe, there'd be hell to pay from every direction. Jake pulled his spare bandana from his saddlebags and began fashioning a pressure bandage for the mare's wound. "Well, Miss Hawkins, we need to get Belle here back to town before she bleeds out, but it's going to be a hard ride, and I'm not sure she can make it on her own." "Then what do we do?" Jake looked at the sun, measuring time the way a cowboy learns to do. Past 9 o'clock already, and a good 7 miles to Cedar Ridge. If they tried to walk the mare back, they'd never make it before dark. If they tried to ride her, the exertion might kill her. "We're going to have to double up on my horse and lead her slow," he said finally. "It's the only way." As he helped Charity to her feet, careful not to jar her further, the folded marriage paper crinkled against his chest. Eleanor would be expecting him by afternoon to go over the final arrangements. If he was late, if something went wrong, it might mean the difference between a new life and another year of wandering. But looking at the girl's frightened face, and the wounded mare's laboured breathing, Jake knew there was really no choice at all. He boosted Charity onto the buckskin's back, then took Belle's reins and began the long walk towards Cedar Ridge, the sun climbing higher with every step. The first 2 miles passed without incident, the buckskin carrying double with the steady patience of a cow horse, Belle limping along behind them with her head low, but her steps sure. Jake had fashioned a lead rope from his lariat, keeping the injured mare close enough to watch, but far enough away that she wouldn't spook his gelding. Charity rode in front of the saddle, her back straight despite her obvious exhaustion. She'd said little since they started, but Jake could feel the tension in her shoulders every time Belle stumbled or whickered in pain. "You race every morning?" he asked, partly to distract her and partly to keep his own mind off the time they were losing. "Belle's the fastest horse in 3 counties, Charity said, pride creeping into her voice. "Father says it's unseemly for a preacher's daughter to ride like a Comanche, but I've been racing since I was 12. Sounds like you know what you're doing." "Usually," her voice caught. "But Belle's getting old and I've been pushing her too hard. This is my fault." Jake adjusted his grip on Belle's lead rope as they navigated around a patch of prickly pear. The mare was favouring her injured leg more now, and her breathing had grown laboured. They'd need to rest soon, but every minute they stopped was another minute closer to sunset. In his vest pocket, the marriage paper seemed to pulse with the rhythm of his heartbeat. Eleanor would be at her father's store by now, putting the finishing touches on her wedding dress. He'd promised to meet her at 2 o'clock to walk through the ceremony with Preacher Hawkins. He remembered how she had pressed a blue ribbon into his palm the night before, the one she used to tie her hair when they first met. "Bring it back to me tomorrow," she'd said with a smile, "so I know you'll stand at the altar." The ribbon was folded now inside his vest pocket, a softer weight beside the marriage paper, and thinking of it, made the choice ahead burn sharper. "Mr. Torrens?" Charity's voice broke through his worries. "Jake's fine, miss." "Jake, then. Why were you riding to Cedar Ridge this morning?" He almost told her. The words were right there about Eleanor, about the wedding, about the 40 acres of good grazing land that would finally give him something to call his own. But something held him back. Maybe it was the way Charity trusted him completely, or maybe it was the knowledge that her father would be the one performing the ceremony. "Business," he said instead. "Meeting someone about a land deal." They crested a low hill, and Jake could see Willow Creek winding silver through the cottonwoods ahead. The crossing would be tricky. The spring rains had swollen the creek beyond its usual bounds, and the current looked stronger than he'd expected. "We'll water the horses and rest a bit," he decided. "Belle needs to cool down, and we need to figure out the best way across." As they approached the creek bank, Jake noticed something that made him pull up short. Fresh horse tracks in the mud, at least 6 riders, maybe more. The tracks were heading north toward the crossing, and they couldn't be more than an hour old. "What is it?" Charity asked. "Riders came through here not long ago," Jake said, studying the tracks, moving fast, and not trying to hide their trail. It could be anything cowhands heading to town for supplies, travellers making for the railroad, or just neighbours, visiting neighbours. But something about the urgency of the tracks, the way they'd churned up the soft earth near the water, set Jake's nerves on edge. He helped Charity down from the buckskin and let both horses drink while he examined the crossing. The creek ran deep and swift here, deeper than he'd hoped. Belle would have to swim part of it, and with her injury, that might be more than she could manage. From his saddlebags, he pulled a yellowed postcard, a picture of the Texas state capitol that his brother had sent him from Austin 5 years ago. On the back, in faded pencil, were directions to a shallow crossing 2 miles upstream. Jake had forgotten about the card until this moment, but now it might be their salvation. "There's another crossing upstream," he told Charity. "Shallower water, but it'll cost us time." Charity looked at Belle, who stood with her head hanging low, blood seeping through the makeshift bandage. How much time? An hour? Maybe 2? The girl's face went pale. "Father will be worried sick if I'm not home by noon. He has a wedding to perform at sunset," and she stopped, her eyes widening as understanding dawned. "That's why you're going to town, isn't it? You're getting married." Jake felt heat rise in his cheeks. "The ceremony's at sunset. If we can get Belle home safe, I should still make it in time." But even as he said it, he wasn't sure it was true. The sun was already approaching its zenith, and they had at least 5 miles still to go. Add in the detour to the shallow crossing, plus whatever delays Belle's condition might cause, and they'd be cutting it close. Very close. Charity bit her lip, and for a moment Jake thought she might cry. Then she straightened her shoulders and gave him a look that reminded him powerfully of her father's Sunday sermons, all steel and determination wrapped in deceptive gentleness. "Then we'd better get moving," she said. 2 miles upstream, they found the shallow crossing just as the postcard had promised. The water ran clear over smooth limestone, knee-deep to a horse and barely swift enough to ruffle the surface. Belle entered the creek willingly, her hooves finding purchase on the solid rock bottom. Halfway across, her injured leg slipped on the slick limestone. She went down hard, the rope jerking taut, nearly pulling the buckskin off balance. Charity screamed. Jake kicked free of a stirrup, boots splashing, as he plunged into the current. He got both hands on Belle's bridle, hauling her head above water while the gelding danced against the pull of the rope. For a moment the whole crossing teetered on disaster then. Belle found her footing again, trembling but upright, blood curling away in red ribbons. As they steadied, Jake spotted a leather satch. A leather satchel caught on a fallen cottonwood branch, the water tugging at its straps. It hadn't been there long. The leather was still supple, not waterlogged. "Hold up," he told Charity, and waded into the creek to retrieve it. Inside the satchel were papers, bank drafts, property deeds, and at the bottom a letter bearing the seal of the First National Bank of Cedar Ridge. Jake's blood went cold as he read the first few lines. The bank was calling in loans, foreclosing on properties, and the letter was addressed to Preacher Hawkins. "What is it?" Charity asked, but her voice sounded strange, distant. Jake looked up to find her staring not at him but at the satchel in his hands. Her face had gone white as chalk, and her hands were shaking. "You know what this is," he said. "It wasn't a question. The riders you saw," she whispered, "the tracks by the creek, they weren't just passing through, were they?" "Who were they, Charity?" She was quiet for so long that Jake thought she wouldn't answer. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, she said, "Bankmen. They came to the house yesterday, 3 of them in black suits, riding like they owned the world. They said Father had to pay what he owed by sunset today, or they'd take the church, the parsonage, everything." Jake felt the folded marriage paper crinkle against his chest as his heart hammered. How much does he owe? $200. Father borrowed it last winter when the typhoid came through. He used it to buy medicine, food for the families who couldn't work. He thought he could pay it back from the collection plate, but... She gestured helplessly. "Have you seen the collection plate at a frontier church? We're lucky to get $2 on a good Sunday." The pieces fell together in Jake's mind with sickening clarity. The bankmen had been carrying the money somewhere, probably to the county seat, to file the foreclosure papers. Now they were dead or fled, and their satchel, full of other people's mortgage payments and property deeds, was floating in Willow Creek. "They must have tried to cross during the flash flood last night," Jake said, more to himself than to Charity. "Creek would have been running 8 feet deep and mean as a rattler." "The money," Charity said suddenly. "Is there enough in there to save the church?" Jake counted quickly through the bank drafts and cash. More than enough, nearly $1,000 in total. But it wasn't theirs to take, and using it would make them thieves, even if the cause was just. "It's not our money, Charity, but Father the Church," her voice broke. "There's a wedding at sunset. Your wedding. If there's no church, no preacher." Jake stared at the money in his hands, feeling the weight of impossible choices. The marriage paper in his vest pocket represented everything he'd worked for. But taking this money, even to save the church, even to help the preacher, would make him no better than an outlaw. "We return the satchel to the bank," he said finally. "Let them sort out who it belongs to." Charity's shoulders sagged, but she nodded. "You're right. It's just. Father's worked so hard, helped so many people, it doesn't seem fair." As they resumed their journey toward Cedar Ridge, Jake found himself thinking about fairness, about the choices a man makes and the prices he pays for them. The sun continued its relentless march across the sky, and with each passing minute, his chances of reaching Eleanor on time grew slimmer. Behind them, Belle limped along with quiet courage, her wound still seeping but her spirit unbroken. Ahead lay Cedar Ridge, and whatever fate awaited them all at sunset. The last 3 miles to Cedar Ridge tested them all. Belle's strength was fading with each step, and twice they had to stop to rest her and retie the bandage around her wound. The sun climbed toward its peak, then began its slow slide toward the western horizon, marking time with the precision of a courthouse clock. Jake found himself checking the marriage paper compulsively, unfolding it just enough to see his signature at the bottom, then folding it back against his heart. Eleanor would be wondering where he was by now. They'd planned to meet at 2 o'clock, and the sun was already past its zenith. "Tell me about her," Charity said during their second rest stop. She sat beside Belle in the shade of a gnarled oak, one hand resting on the mare's neck. "About who?" "The woman you're marrying." "What's her name?" Jake hesitated, then decided there was no point in pretending any more. "Eleanor Briggs. Her father owns the general store in town. I know Eleanor," Charity said. And something in her tone made Jake look up. "She's practical." Father always said Eleanor was steady, the kind of woman who could keep a household upright in hard times. What's that supposed to mean? "Nothing bad. Eleanor's a good woman, a sensible woman. She'll make someone a fine wife." Charity paused, stroking Belle's muzzle. "It's just that she's always struck me as the sort of person who has everything planned out 5 years in advance. No surprises, no adventures." Jake thought about that as they resumed their journey. Eleanor was practical, it was true. She'd waited 2 years for him to save enough money to buy land, to prove he could provide for a family. She believed in planning, in careful choices, in building something solid and permanent. Was that so wrong? "Adventures are overrated," he said finally. "I've had enough wandering to last a lifetime. What I want now is something stable, something that'll last. And what if it costs you everything else?" Before Jake could ask what she meant by that, they crested the final hill before Cedar Ridge, and the town spread out below them like a promise. The church steeple rose white and clean against the blue sky, and Jake could see smoke rising from the chimneys of the houses clustered around the main street. They were going to make it. Belle was still walking, Charity was safe, and there was still time if they hurried for Jake to clean up and meet Eleanor before the ceremony. That's when they saw the crowd gathered around the church. Even from a distance, Jake could tell something was wrong. Too many people, too much commotion for a normal Sunday afternoon. As they drew closer, he could make out individuals in the crowd: Banker Morrison in his black suit, Sheriff Dawson with his hand resting on his gun, and in the center of it all, Preacher Hawkins standing on the church steps with his shoulders squared and his chin raised in defiance. "They're going to foreclose," Charity whispered, "right now in front of everyone." Jake's hand went instinctively to the bank satchel tied to his saddle. Inside were the papers that could solve everything if he was willing to become a thief. The marriage paper crackled against his chest, a reminder of what he stood to lose. "Charity," he said suddenly, "that postcard in my saddlebags, where did it say it was from?" She gave him a puzzled look, then pulled the yellowed card from his bags. "Austin." "Why?" "Read me the message on the back. Jake found work at the land office. Good money, steady hours. Come north if you want a fresh start. Your brother, Tom." She looked up at him. "I don't understand." "That postcard's 5 years old," Jake said. "My brother sent it when I was still punching cattle down in the Nueces country. I kept meaning to write him back, kept meaning to take him up on that offer. But I was always too busy chasing the next job, the next stake, the next chance to prove myself." The crowd around the church was getting louder now. Jake could hear Banker Morrison's voice carried on the afternoon breeze, cold and official, as he read from a legal document. "What are you saying?" Charity asked. Jake looked at her, this brave girl who'd trusted him with her horse and her safety, then at the crowd below, where a good man was about to lose everything for the crime of helping his neighbors. Finally, he looked at the bank satchel with its cargo of other people's money and other people's dreams. "I'm saying maybe it's time I stopped planning so careful and started doing what's right." He spurred the buckskin toward town, toward whatever consequences awaited them all. The crowd parted as Jake rode into the churchyard with Charity behind him and the wounded Belle in tow. Every face turned toward them, some curious, some suspicious, all waiting to see what this dusty stranger would do. Banker Morrison stood on the church steps beside Preacher Hawkins, a foreclosure notice in his manicured hands. He was a small man, made large by expensive clothes and the authority of money, but when he saw Jake dismount, something flickered in his eyes that might have been recognition. "Mr. Morrison," Jake called out, his voice carrying across the sudden silence, "I believe this belongs to your bank." He held up the leather satchel, and the banker's face went white. "Where did you find that?" Morrison demanded. "Willow Creek Crossing. Looked like whoever was carrying it tried to ford during last night's flash flood." Jake's eyes never left the banker's face. Dangerous thing, trying to cross a swollen creek in the dark. Man could get swept away, lose everything. The crowd murmured, understanding beginning to dawn on faces throughout the churchyard. Sheriff Dawson stepped forward, his hand still resting on his gun butt. "Open it," the sheriff said quietly. Jake undid the leather straps and emptied the satchel's contents onto the church steps. Bank drafts, cash, property deeds, and mortgage papers scattered in the afternoon breeze. The crowd pressed closer, and Jake heard gasps of recognition as people spotted their own names on various documents. "That's my loan payment," said Mrs. Henderson from the general store. "I gave it to your men yesterday." "And that's mine," added Tom Fletcher, the blacksmith. 3 months' worth. Banker Morrison's composure cracked like river ice in spring. "Now see here, those are legitimate bank documents. Whatever happened to my men has nothing to do with your men." Sheriff Dawson's voice cut through Morrison's protests. "Seems like you know more about this than you're letting on, Morrison." While the banker sputtered denials, Jake caught sight of Eleanor Briggs standing at the edge of the crowd. She wore her best dress, blue silk with tiny pearl buttons, and her blonde hair was arranged in the style she'd planned for their wedding. When their eyes met across the churchyard, Jake saw something in her expression that made his heart sink. Disappointment. But not the sharp pain of heartbreak, something cooler, more resigned. The look of a woman who'd had her suspicions confirmed. "Ladies and gentlemen," Preacher Hawkins called out, his voice carrying the authority of Sunday sermons, "I think we need to sort this out properly. Sheriff, perhaps you'd be good enough to examine those documents?" As Sheriff Dawson began going through the papers, Jake helped Charity down from his horse. The girl was swaying with exhaustion, and Belle looked ready to collapse. Several townspeople rushed forward to help with the injured mare, including Mrs. Patterson, the midwife, who took charge with the brisk efficiency of someone accustomed to emergencies. "That wound needs proper cleaning and stitching," Mrs. Patterson announced after a quick examination. "But she'll live, if we take care of her." "Thank you," Charity whispered, tears streaming down her face. While the midwife tended to Belle, Sheriff Dawson finished his examination of the bank documents. His face was grim as he looked up at the crowd. "Near as I can tell, every mortgage payment and loan installment made to the bank in the past month is here," he said. "Plus a fair amount of cash that doesn't seem to belong to anybody in particular. Interest payments," Morrison said quickly. "Profits from various investments." "Maybe," Dawson replied, "or maybe money that was meant for the county treasury, seeing as how there's a bill of sale here for some school property that hasn't been approved by the county commissioners." The sheriff's words hit the crowd like a physical blow. Several people began talking at once, their voices rising in anger and disbelief. Morrison looked around desperately, seeming to realize for the first time that he was outnumbered and far from help. In the midst of the commotion, Jake felt a touch on his arm. He turned to find Eleanor beside him, her blue eyes serious but not unkind. "We need to talk," she said quietly. They walked a short distance from the crowd, stopping beside the white-painted fence that surrounded the churchyard. Eleanor's dress rustled in the afternoon breeze, and Jake caught the faint scent of the lavender water she wore on special occasions. "You're not going to marry me," she said. It wasn't a question. Jake pulled the folded marriage paper from his vest pocket, creased and worn from handling. "Eleanor, It's all right, Jake. I've been watching you for the past hour, watching the way you look at that girl, the way you threw yourself into helping her without a thought for the consequences." Eleanor's voice was calm, almost peaceful. "That's not the man I fell in love with. I don't understand. The man I loved was careful, planned everything, never took unnecessary risks. He would have found a way to get help for the girl without endangering his own future." She touched the marriage paper gently. "But the man who carried her 10 miles, who risked everything to see her safe, that's a different person entirely." Jake stared at the paper in his hands, seeing it clearly for perhaps the first time. It wasn't a promise of love, it was a contract, a business arrangement dressed up in white silk and orange blossoms. "Maybe you're right," he said finally. Eleanor smiled, and for a moment she looked almost beautiful. "I usually am. Besides, I've been thinking lately that maybe I'm not ready for marriage either. Father's been wanting to expand the store, maybe open a branch in Austin. It might be nice to see something of the world before I settle down." From the crowd near the church came a sudden cheer. Jake and Eleanor turned to see Sheriff Dawson placing iron manacles around Banker Morrison's wrists, while Preacher Hawkins held up a handful of mortgage papers. "Looks like the church is safe," Eleanor observed. and it seems like there might not be a wedding after all. No, Jake agreed. I don't think there will be. Eleanor stood on her toes and kissed his cheek lightly. Be happy, Jake. Whatever you do next, be happy. She walked away without looking back, her blue dress bright against the dusty street. Jake watched her go, feeling oddly light, as if some burden he'd been carrying for years had suddenly been lifted from his shoulders. Near the church, Charity was sitting beside Belle, stroking the mare's neck, while Mrs. Patterson finished bandaging the wound. When she saw Jake approaching, the girl looked up with eyes that held a lifetime of gratitude. Belle's going to be fine, she said. Mrs. Patterson says she'll be racing again within the month. And what about you? Jake asked. I'm fine too, thanks to you. She paused, studying his face. But something's changed. What happened with Eleanor? Jake looked down at the marriage paper in his hands, then deliberately tore it in half. The pieces fluttered away in the afternoon breeze, carrying with them 2 years of careful planning and cautious dreams. I remembered something my brother told me once, he said. Sometimes the best adventures are the ones you never planned for. Charity smiled with weary relief, the first unguarded look he'd seen all day. So what happens now? She asked, her voice more like a daughter leaning on an older brother than anything else. Jake pulled the yellowed postcard from his pocket, reading his brother's faded words one more time. Austin wasn't so far away, and there were worse things than working in a land office. Maybe it was time to take Tom up on that 5-year-old offer. Now we make sure Belle gets proper care, he said. And then maybe we see about that fresh start my brother mentioned. As the sun touched the horizon, painting the Texas sky red and gold, Preacher Hawkins called the crowd to order for an impromptu service of Thanksgiving. There would be no wedding that evening, but there was much to be grateful for: a crooked banker exposed, a church saved, and a brave horse on the mend. Jake stood at the back of the crowd, Charity beside him, and listened to the preacher's words about providence and second chances. In his pocket, the postcard seemed to warm with possibility, and for the first time in years, Jake found himself looking forward to tomorrow. At the final amen, as the crowd began to disperse, Preacher Hawkins approached them with something wrapped in brown paper. For the man who brought my daughter home safe, he said, pressing the package into Jake's hands. Inside was a photograph of a white mare, Belle's mother, according to the inscription, along with her registration papers and a bill of sale made out in Jake's name for the sum of $1. But I can't, Jake began. A promise is a promise, the preacher said firmly. At sunrise I offered you the white mare. She may be gone to greener pastures now, but her bloodline runs true. Belle's carrying a foal, and come spring, you'll have a colt with the best racing stock in Texas. Jake looked at Charity, who was trying hard not to cry. Your father's giving me Belle's foal? Belle's always been mine, Charity said. And I say her baby should belong to the man who proved a true friend to our family. As the last light faded from the western sky, Jake helped Charity lead Belle toward the parsonage, where a warm stable and fresh hay awaited. Tomorrow would bring new choices, new possibilities, and maybe, if he was very lucky, the adventure he'd been avoiding all his life. The marriage paper was gone, but something better had taken its place. The knowledge that sometimes the best gifts come not from careful planning, but from the simple act of doing what's right when it matters most. If you'd like more stories like this, stay a while. I'll tell the next one tomorrow night.